Most lifters are limited in how much time they have available to train. So in this video, we will be covering some strategies to help us get the best possible hypertrophy stimulus within the least amount of time to make our training sessions more time efficient. First, let's cover what exactly we mean when referring to time efficiency. Time efficiency has two separate components to it: duration of our training session and the hypertrophic stimulus. Essentially, the goal here is to reduce our duration of training and increase the hypertrophic stimulus of each session. This means there are two different ways that we can make our training sessions more time efficient. First is by getting an equal hypertrophic stimulus in a shorter time frame, so the actual outcomes are the same, but we achieve this in a shorter time frame, freeing up time for other important commitments in the rest of our life. And second is by actually improving the hypertrophic stimulus within the same time frame, so the stimulus is superior, but the session takes the same amount of time to complete. And as an extension of these two methods, we could even achieve both at the same time. This means improving the hypertrophic stimulus and achieving this in less time. In either case, this is relevant to almost all lifters. Whether we are short on time to train, or we have plenty of time to train but we want to maximize our effort in the gym, the strategies we will discuss will probably be relevant to you. So let's now cover how we can make our training sessions more time efficient. The first strategy is to make sure we are training with sufficient intensity. Intensity in the context of hypertrophy training refers to proximity to failure, or how close to failure we take each set. It is quite clear that training closer to failure is generally more hypertrophic. This doesn't mean we need to take each set to complete failure, it just means we want to train fairly close to failure. As a general guide, when training on the heavier end of the hypertrophy spectrum with around 6 to 10 reps, we can afford to train a little further from failure, probably around 2 to 3 reps in reserve. When training with a moderate rep range around 8 to 15 reps, we probably want to train slightly closer to failure, probably around 1 to 2 reps in reserve. And when training with higher rep ranges in the 15 to 20 plus range, we need to train closer to failure to maximize muscle growth, probably around 0 to 1 reps in reserve. While we all think that we are training close to failure, oftentimes we may not be as close as we think. This is usually the case for more isolation type lifts, like bicep curls or calf raises, rather than free weight compound lifts like the squat or bench press. Sometimes when the repetition speed starts to slow down, we perceive this as being very close to failure, and we may end the set there. However, we often still have multiple good quality reps left in the tank that we haven't tapped into yet. So the recommendation here is to ensure you are actually training close to failure with strict and effective technique, and not leaving multiple reps in each set before this point. This will make each set slightly more hypertrophic, increasing the overall efficiency of the training session. A simple way to ensure you are training close to failure is to not count your reps for a set and purely concentrate on taking the set close to failure. Focus on the feeling of muscle contraction and the rep speed to get a true reflection of what going close to failure really feels like. Over time, as trainees become more experienced, they will likely become better and better at judging proximity to failure, improving their overall training efficiency. The second strategy to help make training more time efficient is to manipulate volume. This refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group throughout the week. We generally find that more volume tends to result in greater muscle growth, assuming other variables are equated. However, it is probably not a linear relationship, rather the volume hypertrophy relationship probably looks more like this. As we can see, more volume will probably result in greater hypertrophy gains, but each additional set will have less additive benefit. This idea was established by the systematic review, which explored the evidence on low versus moderate versus high volume training. These categories were defined as low volume being training a muscle with less than 12 sets per week, moderate being 12 to 20 sets per week, and high volume being greater than 20 sets. It was found that while moderate volume training, so 12 to 20 sets per week, was significantly superior to training with less than 12 sets. However, high volume training was only marginally superior to moderate volumes. So performing more than 20 sets per week was only a little better than performing 12 to 20 sets. So with this background information now established, there are two methods in which we can manipulate volume to help make our training sessions more time efficient. First is by reducing our overall training volume. While this seems counterintuitive, it may actually be a viable strategy for some people. This is because, like we mentioned earlier, doing more volume likely has diminishing returns. So rather than pushing our volume very high, somewhere around this point here, we may be able to grow at around 80 to 90% of this rate by performing substantially less volume, somewhere around this point here. So as we can see, lower volumes probably have a higher return on investment, so to speak, while higher volumes are more appropriate for those who have lots of time to train. So while reducing volume probably won't make you make greater hypertrophy gains, it can certainly have a major impact on how long you spend in the gym. So we can make almost as good progress with less volume in a much shorter time frame. This trade-off of time versus the hypertrophic stimulus may be a worthwhile strategy for some people. And the other way we can manipulate volume to make training more time efficient is via what I like to call volume allocation. This refers to how much volume we train each individual muscle with. So rather than performing the same number of sets for each muscle, we may want to allocate more or less volume to different muscles based on which muscles are more or less developed relative to others. In simple terms, we would probably want to perform more volume for our weaker muscle groups so that they can grow at a faster rate, and we would probably want to perform less volume for our stronger muscle groups to grow at a slightly slower rate. So if a muscle group is currently being trained with a fairly high volume, and it is already one of our more well-developed muscle groups, then maybe we can just reduce how much volume we are training that muscle with. Similarly, if there is a muscle you aren't particularly concerned with developing, then you can drop the volume for that muscle group. This will improve time efficiency by making your overall workout time shorter, or by freeing up time to train other muscles with more volume. The next strategy to make training more time efficient is to increase training frequency. This refers to how many times per week each muscle is trained. While training frequency doesn't seem to have any major influence on hypertrophy when volume is equated, it can make our training slightly more time efficient. We generally find that training a muscle more frequently tends to result in slightly greater muscle growth compared with training a muscle less frequently, even with the same amount of volume. For example, this study explored the effects of performing a volume-matched training routine with different frequencies. One group performed a split routine, where each muscle was hit only once per week, while the other group performed the same exercises in a full body routine, training each muscle 3 times per week. As we can see, both groups saw significant muscle growth, but the higher frequency training resulted in slightly greater gains for all muscles measured, as shown in the orange bars. As an example, let's say we trained a muscle with 12 sets per week. We could perform all 12 sets in a single workout, we could perform 6 sets across 2 workouts, or we could perform 4 sets across 3 workouts. Although the total weekly volume is the same for each example, we would probably see greater muscle growth when hitting a muscle 2 or 3 times per week compared with performing all sets in a single session. So lifters can make their training routines more time efficient by increasing how many times each muscle is trained per week. This can be achieved by manipulating our weekly training split. For example, let's say we are currently performing an upper-lower 4 time per week training split, where each muscle is hit 2 times per week. We may see a small benefit from changing to a higher frequency routine, like a full body routine with less volume per session, where most muscles are now hit 4 times per week. So even if total weekly volume is the same for each muscle group, we will likely see a small benefit over the original upper-lower split. The next strategy we have is to manipulate exercise selection. This refers to which exercises we implement to train each muscle group. There are 2 ways that we can manipulate exercise selection to make our sessions more time efficient. Let's now cover what they are. The first method is to preference bilateral exercises over unilateral exercises. Bilateral exercises are those which involve training both limbs together, while unilateral exercises involve training only one limb at a time. For example, a bilateral exercise would be something like a back squat, while a unilateral exercise would be something like a split squat. Quite clearly, unilateral exercises take much more time compared with bilateral exercises. They generally take twice as much time because you are essentially performing 2 sets in a row rather than one single set. So a simple strategy to get just as much of a stimulus in less time is to limit or even eliminate the use of unilateral exercises in your training program. And another strategy to make training sessions more time efficient is via the selection of free weights versus machine-based lifts. In general, free weights usually require more balance, stability, and coordination compared with machines or cable movements. This also means that we usually have more accessory and stabilizer muscles involved in the lift, and greater cardiovascular demands too. This means we will likely need longer rest periods between sets of free weight exercises to make sure all systems are recovered before the next set. So while each set of lifting itself is probably not different in duration when comparing free weights versus machine exercises, rest periods likely will be. For example, if we perform 3 sets of squats, 3 sets of stiff leg deadlifts, and 3 sets of lunges compared with 3 sets of hack squats, 3 sets of back extensions, and 3 sets of leg extensions, the total session time will likely be far shorter with the machine-based session. Let's say for this example, each set takes approximately 1 minute to complete to make things simple. The free weight lifts may require around 3 minutes rest between sets, while the machine exercises may only require 2 minutes rest. So the total session time for the free weights would be around 33 minutes, while the machine-based session would be only 25 minutes, even though total volume is the same. It could be argued that the free weight lifts might induce a better hypertrophic stimulus, which can certainly be true in some cases. So I don't think it is necessarily a good idea to only perform machine-based lifts, but it may be a useful strategy to replace some free weight lifts with machines if the goal is to make training more time efficient. The next strategy is to shorten our interset rest periods. This may seem counterintuitive to some extent, considering that the research shows that longer rest periods may be slightly superior for muscle growth. This was established in this systematic review, which explored the research on how rest periods influence muscle growth. It was concluded that both short and long rest periods are effective at promoting muscle growth, although longer interset rest periods are slightly superior in most cases. So while longer rest periods may be a little more hypertrophic on a per set basis, they will also make our resistance training sessions much longer. In fact, most of our training time is made up of resting rather than actually lifting. So while shortening our rest periods may provide a slightly inferior hypertrophy stimulus, it can make our training sessions drastically shorter. This can make sessions more time efficient by either getting a slightly inferior stimulus but in a much shorter time frame, or by freeing up more time to do more volume in the same time frame, which may actually provide an overall more hypertrophic stimulus. So shortening rest periods may have a slight trade-off in some cases, but it may be worth it for lifters trying to maximize time efficiency. The next strategy is to implement metabolite style training techniques. Metabolite techniques are training methods which generally involve lighter loads with short rest periods, which emphasize the metabolic stress pathway as a mechanism for hypertrophy. Some examples of metabolite techniques are those such as drop sets, myoreps, rest pause, and more. While there are different names for each method, they all essentially function in the same way, involving light loads and short rest. This is a somewhat similar strategy to the rest period discussion we covered, although the application is slightly different. Although traditional training with longer rest periods is generally found to be superior for muscle growth in most cases, metabolite techniques have been shown to be similarly or even more hypertrophic than traditional training in certain instances. More specifically, for isolation lifts, metabolite style training has been shown to be highly effective in a few different studies. For example, this study explored the effects of traditional versus metabolite style training on arm growth. The traditional group performed sets of 8 with 3 minutes rest, while the metabolite training group performed sets of 20 with 30 seconds rest. And as we can see, both training methods resulted in significant muscle growth, but the metabolite style training resulted in superior growth of the arms. Furthermore, the metabolite training methods in this study would have been completed much faster. According to the protocol laid out in the study, we can calculate that the traditional training would have taken approximately 69 minutes to complete, while the metabolite training would have taken only around 27 minutes. So as we can see, metabolite style training can drastically reduce training time while providing an equivalent or even superior stimulus. However, it should be noted that this is only really recommended for isolation lifts like bicep curls, calf raises, or tricep extensions, but not for compound lifts like squats, pull-ups, or deadlifts. This is because short rest periods and high reps may result in excessive cardiovascular fatigue or accessory muscle fatigue, meaning that the target muscle may not limit performance of subsequent sets. However, with isolation lifts, there is only one primary muscle working, so it will almost always be the limiting factor of each set, regardless of how short rest periods are or how high rep ranges are. The next strategy is to minimize the duration of our warm-ups. While warm-ups are certainly an important component for performance-related activities like sport performance and max strength training, they don't seem to be all that important for hypertrophy training. This is due to two separate reasons. First is that we aren't necessarily trying to maximize lifting performance within a hypertrophy training session. The goal is to fatigue and stress our muscles, not to lift the most amount of weight possible. So we aren't really concerned with warming up to optimize performance like we would be for other performance-related activities. And second is because hypertrophy training naturally has a very low injury risk compared with other lifting-related tasks and other sports. This is due to a number of reasons, such as using lighter loads than strength sports, using slower and controlled movements, and the ability to manipulate many different training variables while still achieving a great hypertrophy stimulus. So we don't really need to do any specific warm-up intervention to minimize injury risk like we may with other sports and activities. Instead, we probably just need to do 1 to 2 lighter sets of an exercise before beginning our first working set, at least for compound lifts. And then once we get to our isolation lifts towards the end of a workout, we probably don't even need to do any warm-up sets at all. It should be noted that trainees may still want to include some specific methods into their warm-up if they have any particular long-term joint pains or current injuries. But if there are no particular issues, then an extended warm-up is probably not necessary in most cases. This can save lifters lots of time, which can get them in and out of the gym faster, or it can free up time to perform more exercises or sets if desired. In either case, this can improve our time efficiency of training. And the last strategy to make training more time efficient is by limiting how much time we spend on stretching or mobility work. This is similar to the warm-up discussion, but more so refers to stretching and mobility work specifically. Trainees probably don't need to do any excessive mobility routines in preparation for their hypertrophy session, even if improving mobility is a particular goal. This is because it has been found that resistance training itself seems to be just as beneficial for improving range of motion compared with something like static stretching. This was established in this study, which compared the effects of resistance training versus static stretching on flexibility changes in untrained individuals. It was found that both resistance training and stretching both resulted in similar improvements in hamstrings, hip, and shoulder flexibility. So really, if you were training through a full range of motion with all of your exercises, you probably don't need to do any specific mobility exercises at all. Rather, you may be better off spending this time doing more training volume or leaving the gym earlier. However, like we mentioned in the warm-up discussion, if you have any specific limitations that may inhibit your ability to train, it may be worth doing a few quick drills to temporarily improve mobility before a training session. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Time efficiency is an important part of almost everyone's training routines. We may want to get the same stimulus in a shorter time frame, or we may want to provide a better stimulus within the same time frame. This can be achieved by manipulating certain training variables and implementing certain strategies. Trainees should make sure they are training with sufficient intensity, they can reduce or reallocate volume, increasing training frequency, implementing more machine-based lifts and bilateral exercises, shortening rest periods, implementing metabolite techniques for certain exercises, and to minimize time warming up and stretching. These strategies can help trainees get the most out of each session in the least amount of time. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.